Thank you very much, and welcome to this session. We will run until 1 o'clock. And we have two papers, and the first one will be given by Owain Jones, and it's called Monsoon Tide. And Owain Jones is a cultural geographer and became the first professor of the environmental humanities in the UK in 2014 at Bath University, and is now deputy director of the newly formed Research Centre for the Environmental Humanities at the same university. I think we should congratulate you for having achieved such a chair and sort of perhaps paving the way for new chairs of that kind. They are badly needed. Anyway, I'll pass the floor to you, and you can...
Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks. It's very nice to be here. It's an exciting place to be, and I'm very sorry I wasn't here for yesterday's part of the event, but there's no way I could have been. The Monsoon Assemblages project looks very exciting to me, and I'm keen to learn from it, so I thought, I'll put in an abstract for that. And then I thought, well, I don't know anything about monsoons, which I don't really, but so I've been digging about a bit. But I'm very interested in temporal ecology, I suppose, and I thought, what happens if you start Googling monsoon and tide? And a few things come up. So I'm just going to go through about 20 slides. So I actually got a few. So this is not stolen off the Monsoon Assemblages website. This is a quote from the Monsoon website. And there are three research aims. Obviously, it's an interdisciplinary project which seeks to engage with the watery urban world in ways which heed the lively material agencies of the world. It's very much what's going on in cultural geography, more in human geography, stuff like that, and how the world and places in it, such as cities, are co-constructed and co-performed through nature, economy, culture, materiality, the virtual, and everything. It's all very, where it should be, really. And the great talks this morning were all sort of talking about that sort of stuff in different ways. So modernity and its possible apotheosis, the city, is at such risk and in such a mess, let's face it, partly because it's been blind to all the agencies of nature, the dynamism of nature. We built worlds completely, disregarding what is flowing and what is happening, disregarding the ecological basis of all becoming, the microphone, and our watery becoming. So we really need to gauge for this stuff and find new methods, new mappings, new theories and stuff like that. So I feel that's what this project Monsoon is trying to do, which is great. So one of the things I've sort of written about quite a lot is the temporality of tides. And if society is co-produced and co-performed in nature culture assemblages, we have to realize to what extent nature operates in a whole series of flows, cycles, and trajectories. And these are all meshing together, crisscrossing each other all the time. So you're getting really complex temporal spatial ecologies across a whole range of spaces and times and places, from the micro to the macro. So this is a map, one map I found online of where monsoons happen in the world, and then in a few slides' time you're going to see that cross-cut where high tides map. And then, critically, the Monsoon Assemblages website, so, it's so fundamentally important to grapple with this, because the degree which a lot of the world's populations live in these spaces in potentially quite challenging and difficult situations, especially with climate change. So I've been sort of messing about the idea of ecologies of time and ecological time, two different things really, but very closely related. And I sort of partly sort of going back to my favorite, I have a stock of favorite quotes which I turn to for laziness' sake, really. And Latour says, spaces and times are the consequences of the way in which bodies relate to each other. Instead of a single space-time, we will generate as many spaces and times as there are types of relations. If you think of any space, any scene, any process, there's a whole load of interacting elements or objects or beings, whatever. All those have different spatial, temporal characteristics. The daffodil's stems will die in a few days. We will live However, the building will last however long as the materials, some plastics break down in the sun at a certain speed, and so on. So every entanglement of materiality is an entanglement of different temporalities, and that's what I'm considering as temporal ecology. And there's been some great writers who've written about this. Barbara Adam was very famous about writing about timescapes, taking a notion of landscape but turning it into timescape. And Michael Young's Metronomic Society is quite a nice, sort of more popular science book. And in that, he talks about tides. There are many different types of time, and there's very different ways of measuring time. And the world is full of, in certain places, the world is full of tide clocks. They don't tell you what time it is in terms of solar time. They tell you what time it is in terms of how high the water is. So at London Bridge today, the last high tide was 7.4 meters at 2:32 last night. The next high tide at London Bridge is 7.5 meters, just a tiny bit higher, at 14:22. So I think I'm just trying to figure out a way of thinking about temporal ecologies, and I think, there's lots of different types of temporal sort of signatures. There's flows. Some things just sort of flow. I'm not sure if any of this is quite right, but anyway. Some things flow, some things are in cycles, some things are in trajectories, including spiral trajectories. So I added spirals just now, so just cheating after listening to the last talks. And so the spirals are like cyclical, but they're also trajectories into the future. Sort of you get solar sunspot cycles, but then the sun is evolving through its lifespan. So as the Earth's evolving through its lifespan, evolution is a sort of unfolding process as well. It's full of cycles. And so all these things, but I think in the end, most of them end up being hybrids of all these things. So ice ages are a cycle, but they're never the same. You had snowball Earth. You've had time when there's been no ice on the Earth at all. Maybe we're heading that way again, which is stressful. And obviously, anthropogenic change and climate change is a massive sort of, stirrer up of these cycles into new forms. Ocean currents. And I was thinking about the first great talks and the idea of turning the Earth inside out and stuff like that. A critical thing for the Earth is that it has a magnetic field that is produced by the molten core, which is churning away, and that generates a magnetic field which deflects solar winds. That is fundamental for the critical zone. It's fundamental to the atmosphere. So the very center of the Earth is absolutely a key player in the agencies and the unhappenings in the biosphere and Gaia and stuff like that. Flows. So I think people like Barrard and Elizabeth Gross have written very much that modernity and Enlightenment thinking has completely not got flows and processes. It's object orientated. And so I'm not going to read all these out, but Barrard says a primary ontological unit are not things but phenomena, dynamic topographical reconfigurations, entanglements, relationalities. And sort of Barrard says roughly the same sort of thing. And unless we try and understand how everything is a meshing, flowing performance of material agency, temporal ecology, and stuff like that, we're not really getting the world at all. So this is a processual view of becoming, really, and Masumi is, like Ingold, is very famous in my world, cultural geography, human geography. Also Masumi is, and Masumi draws on Whitehead and other philosophers who've tried to have a process view of philosophy rather than object-orientated view of philosophy. And then they link back to the empiricism of William James and radical empiricism, and Stengers and people like that. So this, after saying, well, I'm just going to start moving towards thinking about tides and monsoons, side by side, alongside each other. So tides, I hope people roughly know what a tide is. The sea goes up and down. In the UK, we live in a macro tidal area, which the sea goes up and down more than 4 meters. But in the space of a number of hours, in a lot of places around the UK and in Europe and America, the surface of the sea will go up and down more than the height of this room in a space of a few hours. And if you think of the force of that, the volume of that, and the consequences of that, it's very profound. So this map here, it's got the black bits of coasts are macro tidal. That's where this. So you've got micro tidal, where the sea only goes up and down a bit, and that's the Mediterranean is micro tidal, mesotidal, and macro tidal. And Lefebvre, in his book Rhythm Analysis, says that you think of macro tidal towns as lunar towns. They're dominated by another form of cosmic time, that of the moon's orbit of the Earth, and then the Mediterranean towns are solar towns, and they have totally different rhythms of commerce, of trade, of everyday life, because the tide is a really profound. It'll shape how a city lives, including London, especially in the older days. So tides have a massive implication for how water behaves and how how rainfall drains off the land, and in other ways too. So where these monsoon areas overlap with high tidal areas there's going to be a lot going on, essentially. A lot of risk and a lot of excitement and a lot of beauty as well. Also, another thing about tides, so tides in some ways are quite simple. Sea goes up and down and in and out because it goes up and down. But as well as being 3 ranges of tides around the world, there's 3 rhythms of tides around the world. There's mixed tides, diurnal tides, and semi-diurnal tides. So a diurnal tide will go in roughly in and out once a day. Semi-diurnal goes in and out twice a day. And then mixed tides, there's a sort of changing pattern between that. And that's caused by where you are on the Earth, the orientation of the coast, and all sorts of things. So you're beginning to get a really complex temporal pattern just with tides. And then if you lay that across other temporal patterns like monsoons, then you're getting into something, hyper complex in a way and unpredictable. But this is why tides are so, I think, exciting and beautiful. And not only do they vary like this, but the high tide will move up and down the Thames estuary. So you'll get a tide table for London Bridge and then a tide table for the other bridges and the other ports and stuff like that. So they will vary by 10 minutes. So you can't. Time famously was sort of universalized in the UK when the railways all started to do whatever they did. You can't do that with tides. People have different high tide times all around the coast. So the tide it's caused basically by the sun and moon and the gravitational interplay between the sun and moon and the Earth. So this is just going on about a slide is saying roughly the same as I've said already, but also a massive influence on the tide is how the Earth spins and the effect it has on the oceans, and then the behavior of water in a space like the North Sea or like the Atlantic or like the Pacific. So there's a lot of scientific studies of tides, and there's been lots of tide recording machines and all sorts of exciting things, and of course nobody could really get to grips with what tides were until Newton, because they didn't know what gravity was, and fundamentally they are gravitational forces. One of the interesting things, going back to the idea of monsoons affect a lot of the world's population because of the location of cities, it's the same with tides. A lot of people live by the coasts, and deltas are famous tidal landscapes because tides tend to wash up deltas. So according to Delta and Net, or Delta Alliance, which are concerned with the conservation of mostly the biodiversity riches in deltas and estuaries, 16 out of the 20 of the world's mega cities are located in deltas. And so tides have a massive effect on these cities, just as much as monsoons do. And I'm really drawn to Giblet's writings on modernity and wetlands in various forms, because he says really modernity and wetlands, there's an antithesis, and modernity hates the sort of uncertain, marshland, tidal landscapes, and liminal landscapes. And so cities have been a sort of colonization of that type of space. But you will, in the end, reap the rewards of doing that if you plan your city, you build your city in a hostile relationship to a wetland, especially in a thing. So, and thanks to Laura Denning, who's over there, kind of Astrid Naemis is talking about tidal zones as ecotones, because they're ecotones are where two sort of forms of habitat or ecology meet, and you get very rich mixings and contestations and all sorts of things. And so tidal landscapes are like where salt water meets fresh water. That's a profound division of space on the earth, and they mix and you get brackish water. But also they are where land and, the land and the oceans meet. And again, that incredibly profound margin on earth is being scrambled by the tides. So you get 1 minute you can be walking around on a beach or in a huge bay or delta, and then 6 hours later that will be way under the sea, and it'll be the space for fish and whatever else happens in the sea. So they're very rich in ecological terms and in sort of economic terms and in cultural terms. And I'm quite interested in the idea of sort of meta-ecology, which sort of like, or meta-temporal ecology, and there's people trying to write about that, which are trying to expand ecological notions to take into this sort of hyper-complexity and fluidity of these types of spaces. I'm just whizzing through these quotes, so they actually remind me roughly what I meant to be saying, rather than you read them. But if anybody wants a copy of this, I'm happy to share it. So actually so this is where I started Googling monsoon and tide, and it soon became clear that there is quite a strong relationship between them, and most of the sort of hits I got were from in India, and the Indian press publish high tide times, especially in periods of monsoon, because they generate all sorts of risks, but the risks are actually quite different, a bit different to what happens in the UK, which I still sort of get my head around a bit. So really the fundamental thing is if the sea level is high, the water cannot drain quickly off land through rainfall, or it cannot drain at all. So these are like sprung gates. That London will be full of these. All the British cities on the coast will be full of these. When the tide is low, the water flows out of them. Simple, rivers and sort of outfalls of sewage systems and stuff like that. When the tide is high, you do not want the water washing back up into these systems. So the seawater pushes the gate shut. So while the sea is high, the water cannot drain out, and so everything will back up. And it's a big business designing these things. There's basic ones just got a spring on. There's bigger sort of tidal gates, but also they're very prone to going wrong for environmental reasons. So they've got to be maintained, and like mud and silt will clog them up. So in monsoon areas, if you get a monsoon incident, or a high rainfall incident when it's high tide, that causes a lot of potential flooding risk. But in the UK, really flood risk comes at high tide. And a neap tide is when the tide is much lower. But they're saying here that there's flood risks in the monsoon at neap tide times as well. So it's all about levels. What level the water is at on the land, what level the sea is at, and I haven't completely grasped why neap tides cause, like the Thames Barrier in London will only shut at high tide. When it's not high tide, there's no problem. The Thames Barrier is just open. In these areas, there's a slightly different dynamic going on. But it's not just about flood risk. There's all sorts of cultural relationships, economic relationships between the tide and the monsoon. And looking at pictures of Mumbai, it's the high tide in monsoon time seems to be a sort of a cultural event and a tourist event as well. So there's masses of pictures of people going out to watch the tides and to experience it on the coast. So this happened on both sides of the North Sea, but I've just got a map thing. So this is the famous and very devastating flood of 1953, and it's sort of like a triple whammy, really. The weather has caused a storm surge which pushes the water high against the coast. There's a high tide as well, and then there's a lot of rainfall. So all the sea level is just crumpling up against the coast. It's getting higher and higher, and it'll come over the sea defences. A lot of these coasts will have sea defences. It'll come over it, but at that point, high levels of rainfall just cannot escape off the land. So you're really getting into a very problematic area. And every now and again, there'll be a temporal sort of coming together where all those things happen to make a dramatic impact. And obviously climate change potentially makes it so. So I did wonder, the terrible cyclone that's just hit Africa and Mozambique, I haven't heard anybody say anything about the tide about that at all, but in fact the Al Jazeera website says that it was associated with a really high tide and storm surge as well. So when these temporal sort of chances really come together, the consequences are very significant. And one thing I've been trying to sort of get my head, sort of trying to think, God blimey, there is, as far as I know, a fixed amount of water on Earth, and there has been, and it will be, and making water is quite difficult, and destroying water is quite difficult. So there's a sort of a geography and ecology in the temporality of water, is where is it at any one time? It's like the yearly carbon sort of report where they say where all the carbon is. Where is the water? What state is it? Is it ice? Is it a vapor? And where is it and what's it doing and what relationship is it to what? There's these constant amazing flows that can be highly problematic, also, but obviously completely fundamental to life as well. So it's just like understanding everything is a sort of a flow within a system, I suppose. And so, but the temporality of tides and the temporality of monsoons are pretty different. So this, on the left, there's the National Oceanographic thing in the UK, list the really high tides coming in the next few years, because they're very significant for all sorts of reasons, commercially, ecologically, flood defense and stuff like that. But you can see how precise they are. They are measured to, almost millimeters, and they're measured to the minute. Because gravity is relatively well understood, the movement of planets is relatively well understood, you can say when a really high tide is coming with a lot of certainty. So they will shut the Thames barrier, for instance. But also local variations such as weather, air pressure, wind direction will change those predictions, and they have to be taken into account. So that's a picture of the Thames barrier being overflooded. You only need a few centimeters rise due to weather or to wind for the whole picture to become very different, very problematic. But I think one of the things, so tide machines, the world is full of exciting looking tide machines, and each cog on the top left one will represent a parameter like the moon's pull, the sun's pull, the effect the orientation of the coast had. And these were made in Victorian times before because they really wanted to know what was going on in the ports for military purposes and for trade purposes. And then they became more sophisticated and became very good at predicting. You could set one of these machines to work for Liverpool, or you could set it to work for London and stuff like that. And I suppose computer modelling is just a sort of, this is an analog type thing. Computer modelling, you just put different parameters into your computer model. But tides are of a sort of temporal form that you can actually build a machine like that to represent a tide for Liverpool. I was thinking, could you build a machine like that, a mechanical one, to represent monsoon events? And I assume you couldn't really, because of the complexity and uncertainty. So I think this is a pretty interesting book which came out in 2009, and it's trying to rethink Mumbai as a city in an estuary, and it's called Soak. And it resonates quite a lot with the talks earlier on, because it's talking a lot about planners and architects need to be much more aware of a sectorial view of the world rather than a planned view of the world. But it starts with this quote about there was a massive rainfall flood event in Mumbai in 2005, but it was very localized, and that's what that quote. So the monsoon hit, but it poured rain in one part of the town and had massive effect. And where, just down the road a bit further down the road, there was much less rain. So that's why there's this temporal dissonance between monsoons and tides, or one of the reasons. So I'm coming to the end now. So when monsoons meets tides, sort of complexity compounds complexity, but there's a sort of temporal ecology going on that there's different forms, duration cycles, spirals of what the atmosphere is doing, what the oceans are doing, what the spin of the earth is doing, all bringing together into local configurations of drama. And I thought, I'll just find some examples of people talking about monsoons and tides. And so in Hungry Tide talks about, well, how does the mixing of fresh water and salt water affect the ecology of the landscape he was talking about? And then there are some physical scientists who look at what happens in deltas and rivers, river mouths, in relation to monsoons and high tides, and how it affects the flow of pollutants, the scouring of channels and stuff like that. But there's not much sort of cultural geography which is really hitting on, looking at these entanglements. So in the past, I've talked quite a lot about tides, trying to think of them spatially and temporally as sort of like rhythm patterns. So it's a patterning of space and a sort of rhythm as a pattern of time, and they're sort of overlaying each other in very complicated ways. But when monsoons and tides meet, that's being sort of doubled up really, and people like Deborah Bird Rose are writing about knots of time, just like you get events, places, events. They're probably the same thing more or less, and where there's an incredible intensity of forces and ecology of temporality twisting together to make a flood or a disaster or something nice. I don't know. So the last bit was I was quite interested in moire patterns, where you get two patterns and then you slide them over each other and they make a totally new pattern just by the interaction of the two patterns. And then some composers try to make moire music, where you start with one beat, then you run another beat underneath it, which has a different sort of sequence, and then you get a third sort of outcome. And I was thinking sort of monsoons, not just monsoons and tides, but all sorts of things operate in this sort of moire effect. And then alongside that, you have a sort of parallax view of what's going on, because everything's always shifting against each other. So if you start to think about a parallax view of a moire pattern, you might feel dizzy. I don't know. I'm going to stop. I'm stopping. Sorry. I hope I didn't last too long.
No, it was perfect. Thank you very much. I think we go right on to the next paper, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards. So please.
I'll clear that.
Jonathan Kane, who is a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in Ocean Humanities for the Global South at the University of Witwatersrand. And his research interests are landscape art, architectural modernism, post-colonialism, and urban queer studies. Very much looking forward to hearing you talk about permeability, ocean, and concrete.
So my condition of joining Oceanic Humanities for the Global South was that I knew nothing about the ocean, but that I was willing to learn about the ocean. And that is what I'm doing publicly today. I usually write about gardening. That was my past. And so I've become more and more interested in concrete, partly because most of the things I do are sort of autobiographical. And my father, with whom I'm estranged, and who's quite a terrible man in lots of ways, happens to be a brilliant concrete engineer. And I'm really drawn to concrete and the beauty of concrete, but would also like to spend the next few years trying to sort of undo his life's work. So this is one of those maneuvers where I'm trying to undo it. And today's talk is particularly about permeability, which is really one of those things that you don't want in concrete. So I phoned my father for the first time in like a couple of years, and I asked him, why don't you want concrete to be permeable? You know, as a sort of basic question. Yeah, I was like, hello, it's me. So he's very excited that I'm working on concrete, and it's fine because he'll never really read what I do, so he'll just, you know, think that it's, and it is a kind of a compliment in a way because he really is a brilliant engineer. However, so this work is connected to a group of other smaller projects that I'm trying to build up as a sort of, I don't know, queer and southern critique of concrete. The other parts are, was inspired by a story of the sabotage of buildings in Maputo in 1974. Certain artist Angela Ferreira has made an artwork about this when she found out about the rumors of engineers pouring concrete down pipes of almost finished buildings, particularly the Four Seasons Hotel, which is now the site of the US consulate in Maputo. And that struck me as just the most kind of violent thing that I'd ever heard anyone do, and spiteful and like childish thing I'd ever heard anyone do with concrete. And it seemed to be the opposite of everything that concrete is supposed to be about, which is future orientated, positive, modern, and it struck me that this was a really bizarre thing to do with concrete. So sabotage. The other one is really interesting work that colleagues of mine have been doing on concrete in and building with concrete and self and auto construction of concrete in Luanda and in Maputo. For a long time, those of us who've studied those areas, there's been this idea that there were sort of two cities always. There was the city of concrete, or like Cidade de Cimento, and then Cidade de Canco, which is like the cane city, where everything was made out of reeds. But what both of these, a number of researchers like Claudio Gastro and David Morton have been showing is that for a long time, all sorts of strange micro practices were happening with concrete. Clandestine, because there were times at which it was illegal to build with concrete if you lived in the informal city outside the arc. And so what people were doing was making their own bricks and hiding them, or building foundations with concrete bricks, or using concrete as in almost like decorative ways to paint the inside of houses with a kind of a plaster, which doesn't work very well. But inspectors would go around with sticks trying to push through people's houses to see if they could push through. And so you needed to, and there were huge fines that were meted out, people were imprisoned, houses were razed. And so what's interesting about that is a breakdown of this binary, of the sort of impermanent and the permanent. In fact, in Luanda, informal settlers who are on illegally extra-legally using land are bringing cases to the courts that their houses should not have been demolished because they were built with concrete bricks. And they said sort of you can demolish houses made from impermanent materials like sheet metal or wood, but concrete bricks are something that should be legally protected. And so concrete functions in these spaces in quite like counterintuitive, quite sort of southern ways perhaps. The second last way in which I'm trying to build a picture of concrete is to look at port cities, Mozambique and in Angola during decolonization, and some artists have made great work about the relationship between the crates that were packed, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But in the sort of hysteria to leave, white settlers packed up all their belongings into these crates, and the most iconic depiction of this is Richard Kapuscinski's piece called "We're Closing Down the City," where high-rises in Luanda slowly empty, or quite quickly emptied out into these amazing array of crates, wooden crates. And so there have been quite a few people writing about the relationship between the crate and the concrete building. And the last one is in the London Zoo, which I've been spending this week, where the southern penguins, like penguins are all southern, like I didn't realize that, but the Lubetkin penguin enclosure, which has these just absolutely exquisite concrete ramps, causes often penguins to get a thing called bumblefoot, which is a form of like dermatitis, where the rubbing of their feet on the concrete causes them to get sick. And so in fact the penguin enclosure has been empty of penguins for a number of years, and because it's a protected building, there it is, and it's been renovated, and it's absolutely exquisite. And so what I'm interested in, I guess, when I look at that building is the beauty of concrete and the beauty of that building, which is quite undeniable. I mean, if I was a penguin, if I was a person, I would want to live in that building. But it makes penguins sick. And nothing can live in it. They've tried. I think we went through the death registries, which was really fun, or handwritten. And there was something like 200 different penguins that lived in there, and none of them could flourish. And now they're in this really hideous sort of like faux penguin kind of. It's called a penguin beach, and it's really hideous and really tacky. But they're really happy there. So this project. I want to say 4 things about I'm going to be speaking about a kind of tetrapod. You've seen one over there on the wall that shows the attenuation of wave force. And the tetrapod that I'm speaking about was invented in South Africa, and it's called the dolos. And DOLOS, but it is, I can click a few of these things. There's the dolos. And the word dollar, okay, so I'm going to talk about the dollars, and I'm going to do 4 things. The first one is to try and think a little bit about the oceanic turn, which I think is something that a lot of us are interested in, and I think that it connects to the monsoon assemblages, and Lindsay and others have written about it. And then I want to make a sort of queer critique of modernity. And then I want to think about materiality and penetrability, and then I want to think about a multi-species analysis of this kind of concrete. So the oceanic turn in this context, I think there are 2 things that are worth thinking about. Isabel Hoffman and others have written about how the oceanic turn is partly about thinking more than just the depth of the sea, and more than just the sea or the ocean as a surface to travel across or move over. And so I want to think a little bit here about surface depth rather than surface, or materiality, and the binary opposition of land and sea. And I think that these hard infrastructural zones of interpenetrability are really useful thinking about, or problematizing or complicating our idea of like land and sea and the binary that they might be in. So to do that, I want to tell you a little bit about how and when this dolos was invented. So if you look and you study the history of the dolos, South Africans have only invented about like 10 things. And so we're really proud of like those 10 things. And this is one of the things that we invented. But it turns out that very few people are aware, and certainly not the white nationalists who write online. And if you spend enough time looking at dollars, you will land on sort of white nationalist websites, like one of which is called the White Tribe of Africa, who are terribly proud of the dollars. And it's not incidental why. I'll get to it in a moment. But other tetrapods were invented before the dollars and have been used after the dollars. But so what happened was there was invented by 2 men who were called ocean tamers in the press, which I think is a really beautiful idea of thinking about what they did. A man called Eric Murrayfield and his harbor engineer draftsman Aubrey Kruger, and they both worked for the East London Harbour Engineering for the South African Railways and Harbour Services. So they were government employees, and partly what I want to gesture to is placing these doloses in a history of apartheid, and extending some of the research that's being done in South Africa on the sort of infrastructural and modernist and scientific and engineering processes of apartheid. One of the things that made apartheid particularly unique was its hypermodernity and its interest in concrete as well, obviously. So there was a terrible storm in 1963 that damaged 60% of the East London harbour. That's not your East London, that's our East London. And so the creation of this Dollars is surrounded up with lots of myth. There's no way of really knowing how it was created. But one of the ideas was that one of the men went home and saw his children playing with a toy. They're playing with jacks, and he thought that was. There's another story that the man went home and he took his wife's her broom, chopped it into sections and created this and built up a little model. But what it seems to be clear is that the name Dollars is an Afrikaans word, and its plural is dolosa. And if we think about what's quite important is that Dolluses are almost never by themselves, because that's not what they do. The only times that you really will see a Dollars by itself is sort of, we'll come back to those, is in a drawing like this, or like that in a study, or as a monument. And there's actually quite a lot of monuments that are Dolluses. And I believe in Malay there's a which is what that tetrapod is a response to the tetrapods in Malay, but that almost always they're in a group. And the word Dollars is a Dutch word based on two parts, like dol and os. The first word meaning a Dutch, or dollen, a Dutch plaything, and the second word is os for ox. And so during what was called the Great Trek, which in 1830 was this movement of disaffected white Dutch speakers who began to think of themselves as the Afrikaners, moved up through South Africa to avoid the British, among other things, and to keep their slaves. And the children made these incredibly gruesome little toys made out of sheep's knuckles or goat's knuckles attached to a sheep's jawbone. And these things were called Dolluses. And they would draw the wagon. So they were, in actual fact, goat knuckles that were imaginary oxen. And there's sort of apocryphal stories that these little children learnt this from like sangomas, from like witch doctors who used to play with these bones, or not play, but it became a play story. But nevertheless, what I want to suggest is that reading the Dollars, it's provocative to read in like an interspecies history, to read the Dollars as part goat and sheep, but then also to think of it as a part of an ox. And I think what's interesting about that is the knuckle bone, and the oxen were grouped in what were called teams. So that's a team of oxen over there. It's sort of with the rope in between, and with the, what are those things called? And so in fact what you have as a collective noun is you have teams of Dolluses. Though I'm really interested in thinking about assemblages and like specifics of certain kinds of assemblages, and I think that this scenario is a kind of an assemblage scenario, and I think it's useful to think of it as a team. But I also think that what you get when you think about this is you get the notion of movement that seems to be embodied in these very stable, unmoving objects, although they do move. I mean, that's what makes them particularly useful, is that they do shift slightly and respond to the movement of the water. But the Great Trek, I think, and the story of the oxen give us a sense of thinking about these and thinking about concrete as moving as well. And you don't want to be too heavy-handed and thinking about sort of white apartheid, heterosexual critiques of something like this, but you do want to also think about the potential for a pioneer spirit, especially when you think about white engineers in the 1960s in apartheid solving sort of seemingly technical problems, like inventing petrol, for instance. You know, that South Africa was able to circumvent certain kind of pressures from the world by creating its own petrol, like inventing systems for making petrol. So these were like really dynamic, and there were languages that were built up around these things. So I think that it's important to think about this pioneer spirit. Certainly how my father thinks about himself, and it's certainly how these engineers thought about themselves too. When we think about now the second point, the materiality and penetrability of concrete, one of the problems with, so penetrability is especially, or impenetrability is especially important with water-based concretes. So my father was explaining to me that when you shake the concrete to remove all the bubbles, you have to be especially careful to do it when it has to do with water. And one of the reasons is that in water-based concrete and dolysis are not reinforced. And so they are one of the more important unreinforced concrete objects or pieces of the built environment. And they don't need to be reinforced because they don't have any tensile requirements, right? So they're strong in compression, and so that's why you need the reinforcing. And so essentially, I don't know yet of any other instances where one can really think about important structures that are not reinforced. And if anyone can think of others, but that seems to be something that's interesting about this, is that they're both mobile, but that they're penetrable. So the water can move around them, and you could say, well, lots of things are penetrable, like buildings have doors in them and whatnot that you walk in and out, and so they're penetrable in that way. But there seems to be something sort of fundamentally penetrable about these assemblages. The water moves around them and it gets dissipated by them. And so in a way, the modernity of the dollars is a bit like the modernity of the brise-soleil, that allows sunlight to kind of enter and air to enter through buildings in the south, in Brazil, in South Africa, and in India perhaps. And so what would that mean if we thought about, and some brise-soleil are movable as well, even the concrete ones. So if we think about it as like a brise-soleil for the sea, so it wouldn't be a brise-soleil, it would just be like a breeze, and then the French for ocean, which I don't know. And I don't want to spend too much time on the closing with an artwork, but so wait. So what I feel like I haven't really done is I feel like I haven't really made a good case for why what I'm doing is a kind of queer critique, and I think that what I find interesting about using queer theory when there's no sex involved, and when we're clearly not talking about things that are like homosexual or lesbian or trans, or is to think about modernity as a sort of future-orientated project, and a kind of masculinism of concrete, although there's lots of examples where concrete is not masculine. But one of the key cornerstones of early queer theory was the idea that essentially heterosexuality was based on its impenetrability. To be a heterosexual man was to be not penetrable. So to be like to be something which nothing, to be like a concrete, or to be like a Grecian sculpture made out of, and that nothing could come in or really could go out. And one of the most exciting aspects of queer theory is the embracing of failure and looking for examples where things don't work, where things aren't productive, where things don't go according to plan, where things don't make profit. Authors like Judith Jack Halberstam and others sort of say that what queer people are best at doing is failing, like getting things wrong, and being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so what I think if we look for here, we look for an example of a penetrable structure which opens up a space to see how we move through concrete, but because essentially in any other example, penetrable concrete is a failure of casting. So, I mean, lots of examples of buildings that fall apart and crumble in the water where they rub across. And I want to just end with a beautiful artwork that I can't show you, unfortunately, because it's a video artwork, so I'm going to have to take you through it. But it's called Concrete Affection by an Angolan artist called Kelenju Kaikiahenda. And what he's done is he's taken a walk around the city of Luanda with his camera, and he speaks and writes kind of poetry about this. And he's reenacting the 1975 evacuation of the white settlers who went to Israel, to Brazil, to South Africa, and to Lisbon. And what he does is he gestures to like this really, really intriguing idea that two things for him happen to the buildings. Once everybody takes out all their junk, their pianos and all of their armoires and everything, and they're packed in these crates, he said that, first of all, the buildings seem to levitate. They seem like incredibly, they don't have any weight anymore. And the second thing is that they become penetrable. He doesn't explain why he says that that is the case. But I think it's a really provocative idea of thinking about the evacuation of the white settler and then the sudden kind of penetrability and emptiness and lightness of concrete. And that's what I'm kind of working on, and I appreciate the opportunity to share that and have your thoughts, and I'll end with that. Thank you.
And we now have at least 15 minutes for a discussion. So could I ask the speaker to join us here? Well, thank you so much for these fascinating presentations that somehow talk very much to each other, as I experienced at least. And I saw some interesting, I wouldn't say likenesses, but interesting connections between the two papers, in that they were both concerned with the meeting of different, or the meetings of different time scales, the meetings of different matters, materialities, the meetings of different histories, and so these meetings somehow sort of make new worlds happen in the process. I thought that was a very sort of general theme that connected the two. But I would ask you if you would have sort of the first option of giving a question to your co-panelist. I think if you would want to take the chance, any of you?
I'm more like, I'm not sure this is going to be right at all, but I was thinking, I read a poem and the poet said, the water is moving through the concrete like light is moving through glass, because the water was under pressure. So it's a really boring technical question, but if water's under enough pressure, will it go through concrete like that, or was the poet just making it up?
So, I'd have to ask my father. But I think what he would say is, so concrete has an interesting relationship with water because it requires water in order to set. But it requires exactly the right amount of water, and that sort of ratio is fundamental. But as far as I know, there's no way that water can get through concrete in that way, because unless there's something wrong with it, unless it's bad concrete, because it would then, the main thing is it would get through to the reinforcing, and the reinforcing would rust and snap. So I don't think it's possible, but I like that idea.
Okay. Could I just say something else? So we're very vexed. So we love tidal landscapes, and Bristol and Bath, where I live, is near the Severn Estuary, which is one of the most dynamic tidal landscapes in the world. And there's this big thing about barrages and tidal lagoons, which involves millions of tons of concrete, really, being poured into these tidal landscapes to control them, to harness power. But all the environmental agencies and the nature conservation people and the people at the Seven Rivers Trust, they're profoundly against the pouring of millions of tons of concrete into these landscapes. And really, it is the thing about commerce, you know, who campaigns for the tidal lagoons, which no doubt they're planning or discussing them in the Thames as well. It's not. It's as much the construction industry as it is they will produce a form of. Well, is it green energy? We say it's dirty energy. But so concrete and concrete in liminal landscapes, tidal landscapes, and hardening the coast is a big thing for us. And the Severn Estuary is about 80% of it is lined with sea walls. Much of that is earth bank, but in all the urban areas, it is concrete walls. So it speaks very much to your idea, the thing about trying to completely fix the living interaction between land and sea.
And I think that's what concrete tries to do, is it tries to fix things. So I'm interested in times when concrete doesn't fix. It's actually, there's some really great research on thinking about concrete rather as a process, rather than, and so I think also, I had a question for you. I think quite a few people have been toying with different ways of. So you talked about a liminal landscape, sort of, and it seems hard to find the correct language to think about those spaces that are not. I think Rachel Carson called them sea land.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
How do you have a preferred term?
No. There are some beautiful. There's a lot of. I have a website called Tidal Culture. Well, a blog. It's not that fancy, but there's. I just sort of listed. There's a lot of artists who've done installation type work in relation to tidal cultures, in tidal landscapes, and a lot of the famous poem by Crabbe, which Peter Grimes is based on. There's a lot of literature that's really set in these liminal landscapes, and they bring out the sort of affective qualities. I think sort of trying to move towards sort of affective atmospheres. There's a lot of stuff going on about elemental affects at the moment. What does the air do to society? What does water do to society, but also what do these sort of marshlands do to society? And so I think there's people working on that and writing about it in literature, and there's artists working on it, but there are some really skilled sort of cultural geographers and other people doing it as well. Laura probably has got a good answer to this, I expect, but there we go. Ecotone.
I think we can now take some questions from the audience. Yes, please.
There's a particular book that keeps coming to mind that could have been mentioned yesterday and could have been mentioned today that hasn't come up, and that is specifically queer and southern, and that's Elspeth Probyn's wonderful book called Eating the Ocean. And she uses Eve Koskowski-Sedgwick's definition of queer, which relates the word etymologically to the term athwart, which is a kind of nautical term, and it's about bodies being queerly placed in relation to one another, which is really something that's happening in just about every discussion that we've had. How do we discuss the ecotone at the edge of things? How do we discuss when atmosphere and ground are interpenetrating? And actually interpenetrating is a kind of athwartly sort of way of thinking too. So again, how do I frame a question here? The uses of queer theory for thinking about the connections that are made in ways that industrial capitalist modernity would not really like to have to connect with. Is queerness a really great tool for? I know this is it. I know it's a great tool for thinking this.
So recently, someone was talking about, there was a presentation a few days ago that a friend of mine referred to on Facebook. Someone discussed something as being non-queer, as though like there were two categories. There was like two ways of thinking about things, sort of queer and non-queer, as though they were like equally as useful or politically viable. So I think some things have to not be queer, and some things can be argued to be queer, or just are queer in themselves, and they haven't been kind of seen that way. So I think, I'm trying to think of a nice example of applying kind of queer theory in a non-kind of sexual way. I like Proven's book a lot, and I like that idea, and I had forgotten actually that there's a nautical kind of connection to it. I think what I liked last night was Tim Ingold's idea that on the sea, people hold on to each other in a way. And I haven't thought through what that means, but that seems to do something really different. They don't hold on to the land. They like grasp onto each other. So I wonder if like gay cruising, I don't know, like on the sea, like cruising, but there's something really unproductive about that. I mean, the key queer sea creature is the penguin. And so I don't know how we know how it became the penguin. So the penguin, for me, is an interesting one to think about, because it's become the public face of like animal homosexuality and other than human. So that's a really nice, I'm going to think about that. But I think that the point has to be made that some things just aren't queer and can't be queer.
Thank you. I have a question, I guess a comment to both speakers about the use of concrete in water infrastructure and in the construction industry as a whole. There's a big drive to raise awareness of the carbon emission that concrete produces and what it does to the atmosphere, and this big movement to think of alternatives to concrete in the construction industry, in the UK, for example. And I wonder what your thoughts were, because both speakers use images of large concrete infrastructure to control water, to control the ocean edge, to humanize somehow the landscape. So I wondered what your thoughts were on the two things where we continue to use concrete to control climate, but then have this impact on the climate because of what it's doing, what concrete, the building with concrete is doing to the atmosphere.
Well, obviously, various. In the UK, there was a load of understandable stress and architectural and planning focus on flooding, and some NGO wrote a report in a London-based NGO and said we need to get back to older ways of living with water, or sort of different ways of living in water, sort of pre-concrete in a way. And they were talking about, if you go to certain delta areas, there's houses on stilts, but they were talking about houses that can maybe float up and down, but they need to be light structures. They need to be much more flexible. Kind of, the whole point about concrete is not light and it's not flexible. So it's like the whole sort of mantra of going with the grain of nature, whether it's slowing the flow or, different ways of living with the grain of nature. Concrete seems to be, quite often against the grain of nature in one way or the other. And I was just thinking about, so the penguin pool was designed by Lebetkin and Tecton, and it was, they were the apotheosis of modern movement architecture. And so there does seem to be modernity concrete, fixity, heaviness, which is not the sort of flexible, light on its feet technologies and we need to do things differently.
Then that's it. In Southern Africa, at least, the romance of concrete is not gone. In fact, there's lots of theorists who've written about how, like, modernity and modernism arrives late. It's like already too late, but people are enamored. I mean, there's more and more interest in concrete, more and more passion for building concrete in micro ways. So I don't think that amongst builders in my understanding of Southern Africa, people are giving up on concrete at all. I think that your point is totally right, that one of the most important things that I need to look at and that other people are looking at is the construction industry and the histories of construction industries, the production of concrete and the circulation of concrete, where it's manufactured and how it's sold and how it's distributed. But the love of concrete is still strong.
I just maybe think if you go to Tallinn in Estonia, there's a very massive ruin on the coast, and somebody said go there and figure out what it was. And I went there. It's very spectacular, but I couldn't really figure out what it was. But it is a concrete thing, and it's obviously not built very long ago, and it's completely falling apart. And it was obviously very badly constructed. It was faced to stone, all that's fallen off. A lot of the reinforcing rods are coming to the surface. They were very shallow. And but it's massive and it's very grandiose. And what was it? It was designed for the Moscow Olympics. It was the sailing facility for the Olympics on the Baltic, for the sailing on the Baltic Sea. And it just seemed to me like, wow, the ideology of the Olympics, how London suffered, and totalitarianism, concrete, build this incredible structures that's so showy, but 30 years later, fit for nothing.
I think we can have one more question. There was a hand raised down there before. Thank you. Pausing on the.
Thank you. That is really fantastic. I mean, it's really just a comment. I was just thinking about Barad and how Barad talks about touching, and thinking about touching as a way of understanding quantum field theory. And in a way, I think what Barad's arguing is that everything inherently can be understood through queerness. And so, in a way, I was just wondering what he thought about that.
Through what? Sorry, the last bit.
No, that everything can be understood through queerness, and so I mean, there doesn't have to be a division, and
Yeah.
you know, and
No, you go. You're the expert.
but
Well, I wouldn't. I think there is a sort of. This is a very simple thing to think, but I think if the point is that if everything's queer, then it disappears as a thing. But I also I was slightly surprised you say that, to me it's nothing to do with sexuality at all, really. It's about arrangements. Oh gosh, this keeps doing weird queer things. Anyway, but so I think it is a fundamentally useful concept, but like everything, it can lose its force, like lots of things do in the end, if everybody just sort of jumps completely into it and thing. But Barad is, like Ingold is a great quoted a lot in our worlds, Jane Bennett, and then obviously Barad is as well. She and numerous other people. So so she did make I think everything she says you need to take seriously, essentially.
No, yeah, you did. So yeah, I take the idea that I agree that if everything is queer, then nothing is queer. Then it loses any kind of text. It loses any purchase that it might have. But I think I was thinking about it's a sort of slightly side. I think the oyster is also quite queer, in a way, and they've just been reading about oyster texture, oyster structure, oyster texture. Infrastructures built around around New York that we built from living, dying, growing oysters. And that sort of struck me as a really sort of, in a way, it's quite diabolical in a way, actually, like quite terrifying and somehow more scary than concrete. That you kind of grow your infrastructure. It seems really nightmarish.
Sorry, just a simple comment. Often we end up in this kind of positive attribute to every conceptual category that allows us to undermine the series of oppositions that structure modernity, right? So liminality, ambiguity, all those things are great because it allows us to undermine a series of patriarchal conceptual structures. And yet we also know that capitalism is really, really good at mobilizing liminality and queerness, for instance, in real estate or against class, let's say. So I'll throw back the question to both of you, actually, because I suppose that there's something, there's nothing anti-modern, honestly, in permeability. There's nothing queer about permeability in itself, I suppose. Modernity and every concept of static, patriarchal, has its own embedded concept of permeability. What we have at stake, and I suppose the first presentation touches that slightly more specifically, is what is the politics, both legally, spatially, and many other ways of thinking different rhythms of permeability, thinking what is to be permeable or not. And I was wondering, you mentioned rhythm analysis, for example. I was wondering, for instance, if any of you ever or looks within your own work into how different rhythms of permeability, of ambiguity between conditions, regardless of what, if we're speaking of gender or of soil, earth, and etc., through the frame of law, for instance, through jurisprudence, if that has ever played and plays within your work.
I can only give a non-architectural answer. Well, it's actually an architectural answer that, like, during the 1970s in South Africa, there was a law. It was called the 2 men at a party law. That, like, 2 men were not allowed to move next to each other in a way that excited each other. Because if they did that, it would be considered legally to be a party, and then they could be arrested. And there's a case in which a police officer came into a sex club in the 1970s, into a room where 2 men were having a party, but as he came in, he turned on the light, and the judge found in a really radical ruling that that constituted a party. And so that is the only legal answer I can give you for when penetrability was related to a legal kind of rhythm.
Yeah. An example which I did think about when I came into London on a train, it's not in my work, but the forensic architecture group seemed like quite a cool lot, and they've reconstructed, well, maybe they're not. Anyway, they've done this forensic reconstruction of Grenville, and a lot of it is about the permeability or the impermeability of the flats with fire, and it's absolutely tied to standards, to building standards, to material, concrete. Well, not concrete's probably part of it. The doors, the cladding. To what extent were these units permeable or impermeable to fire? The whole thing was based on that, and there's a whole legal thing about standards and product testing and this, that, and the other, and obviously the degree of which these materials and the system and the legislation is all bound up in law. So that came to mind. I don't know. Like the drainage boards all around the UK, to bring it back to tides and things, they have legal responsibilities to monitor to manage the permeability of the land. The land needs, especially on levels, the land needs levels of water in it. Some of the levels, the field divisions are ditches, and the ditches need a certain level of water. They have to set the sluices. They have to set all the the other infrastructure to allow a certain amount of permeability of ingress and outgress, and if they do not manage that, they are falling foul of the legislation.
Thank you very much. I think we have to close here, and I want to thank you heartedly for your inspiring contributions. Thank you.